When a desperate young woman arrives at widower Jacob Mercer's Montana cabin in 1867, carrying a baby that isn't hers, she makes an impossible request that will either destroy his carefully guarded solitude or give him the family he never dared hope for again. But when the weight of her secret threatens to tear apart the fragile bonds they've built, will Jacob discover that grace isn't something you earn, but something you choose to give? The hammer crashed against red-hot iron with a sound like thunder. Jacob Mercer wiped sweat from his face as sparks flew around his small workshop. The autumn air in Montana territory carried the smell of burning wood and metal. It was 1867, and winter would come soon to the mountains. Jacob's hands shook slightly as he lifted the hammer again. He had been making horseshoes since sunrise, but his mind kept wandering to the empty cabin behind him. 2 years had passed since Martha died, yet her coffee cup still sat on the kitchen table. Her sewing basket remained by the window, untouched and gathering dust. The blacksmith shop felt like a prison some days. Jacob worked alone, ate alone, and slept alone. The townspeople in Copper Creek brought him their horses and farm tools to fix, but they never stayed long to chat. Maybe they thought sadness was catching, like a cold. Bang, bang, bang. The hammer struck the iron again and again. Jacob had always been strong, but grief made him feel weak inside. His shoulders hunched forward as he worked. His brown hair had grown too long, and his beard needed trimming. Martha used to cut his hair every month, her gentle fingers running through it afterward. The workshop walls were thick wood, built to keep out the harsh Montana winds. Tools hung neatly on hooks, hammers of different sizes, tongs for holding hot metal, and files for smoothing rough edges. The forge glowed red-orange in the center of the room, fed by coal that Jacob had to buy from travelers passing through town. Outside, yellow and orange leaves danced in the wind. The cottonwood trees near the creek had turned brilliant gold. Jacob used to walk there with Martha in the evenings, her hand warm in his. Now he avoided that path. Too many memories lived there. A horse whinnied somewhere in the distance. Jacob paused his work and listened. The sound came from the main road that led to town. Maybe someone needed a horseshoe replaced or a wheel repaired. Work was good, it kept his hands busy and his mind focused on something other than the hollow feeling in his chest. The forge fire crackled and popped. Small pieces of coal broke apart and fell through the metal grate. Jacob added more fuel, watching the flames jump higher. Heat washed over his face, making him squint. The temperature outside was dropping, but inside the workshop it stayed warm. Jacob picked up another piece of iron with his tongs. The metal glowed bright orange from the heat. He had been doing this work for 15 years, ever since he married Martha and they moved to Montana. Back then, the territory was newer, wilder. Fewer people lived here, and everyone had to work hard just to survive. His wife had wanted children. They tried for years, hoping and praying. But babies never came. Martha said maybe God had other plans for them. She spent her time helping other women in town when they had their babies, making blankets and cooking meals for new mothers. The iron began to cool and turn darker. Jacob heated it again in the forge, pumping the bellows to make the fire hotter. The bellows wheezed like an old man breathing hard. Everything in the shop was getting old, including Jacob himself. At 42, he felt much older than his years. Snow had started falling early this year. Just a few flakes at first, but they promised more to come. The mountains around Copper Creek were already white at the peaks. Soon, the passes would close, and the town would be cut off from the outside world until spring. Jacob had enough supplies to last the winter, but the long, dark months ahead filled him with dread. He shaped the iron into a horseshoe, bending it carefully around his anvil. The anvil was his most precious tool, brought all the way from back east when he first started his business. It weighed over 200 pounds and had a surface worn smooth by thousands of hammer blows. As Jacob worked, his mind drifted to happier times. Martha laughing at something funny he said, the smell of her bread baking in the oven, the way she hummed while doing chores around the cabin. These memories felt both precious and painful, like holding something beautiful that cut your hands. The workshop door rattled in the wind. Jacob had built this place with his own hands, log by log. It connected to their cabin through a covered walkway, so he could go back and forth without getting wet or cold. Martha had suggested that design. She worried about him working in all kinds of weather. Bang! The hammer hit the iron one final time. The horseshoe was finished, perfectly shaped and ready to be nailed onto a horse's hoof. Jacob held it up to inspect his work. Good craftsmanship mattered, even when your heart wasn't in it. People depended on him to do the job right. But as he set the horseshoe aside with the others, Jacob wondered if anyone would remember him when he was gone. He had no children to carry on his name, no family nearby to visit his grave. Just an empty cabin and a workshop full of tools that someone else would probably buy cheap after he died. The wind picked up outside, howling around the corners of the building. Winter was definitely coming early this year. Jacob shivered despite the warmth from the forge. Something about this winter felt different, like it would bring changes he wasn't ready for. What would those changes be? The knocking sound was so soft that Jacob almost missed it over the wind and crackling fire. He set down his hammer and listened carefully. There it was again, tap, tap, tap. Someone was at his door. But who would visit on such a cold, snowy evening? Jacob wiped his hands on his leather apron and walked to the cabin door. The knocking came again, more urgent this time. He lifted the heavy wooden bar that kept the door secure and pulled it open. Cold air rushed in, along with swirling snowflakes that stung his face. A young woman stood on his doorstep, her dark hair plastered to her head with melting snow. She looked about 20 years old, maybe younger. Her dress was thin and worn, offering little protection against the weather. But what caught Jacob's attention was the bundle in her arms, a baby wrapped in faded cloth. "Please," the woman said, her voice barely a whisper. "I need help." Jacob stared at her in shock. No one lived for miles around his cabin. The nearest neighbor was old Pete Morrison, and he was at least a day's ride away. How had this woman gotten here, especially carrying a baby? "Come in," Jacob said quickly. "You'll freeze out there." The woman stumbled through the doorway, and Jacob could see she was exhausted. Her legs shook as she walked, and her breathing was labored. Ice crystals had formed on her eyelashes and in her hair. She must have been walking in the storm for hours. Jacob helped her to the chair by the fireplace, Martha's old rocking chair. The woman sank into it gratefully, clutching the baby close to her chest. The infant was so small and still that Jacob worried it might be sick or worse. "Let me get you something warm to drink," Jacob said, moving to the kitchen area. His hands shook as he poured water from a pitcher into a pot. He hadn't had a visitor since Martha's funeral. The cabin felt strange with another person in it, like putting on clothes that didn't quite fit. As he built up the fire, Jacob stole glances at his unexpected guests. The woman had closed her eyes and was rocking slightly in the chair. The baby, he could see now that it was alive, made tiny whimpering sounds. The child couldn't be more than a few months old, with wispy brown hair and skin that looked pale from the cold. "What's your name?" Jacob asked gently as he waited for the water to heat. "Rebecca," the woman replied without opening her eyes. Rebecca Shaw. The name meant nothing to Jacob. He knew most of the families in the territory, at least by reputation. But Shaw wasn't familiar. Maybe she was from back east, or from one of the newer settlements further south. "Where did you come from?" Jacob asked. "The nearest town is 2 days' ride in good weather." Rebecca opened her eyes then, and Jacob saw something in them that made his stomach tighten. Fear, desperation, and something else, a kind of hopelessness that he recognized from his own reflection in the mirror. "I walked," she said simply, "from Willow Creek." Jacob's eyes widened. Willow Creek was at least 30 miles away, through rough mountain terrain. To walk that distance in a snowstorm, carrying a baby, seemed impossible. Yet here she was. The water began to bubble in the pot. Jacob added some dried herbs that Martha had used to make tea. The familiar smell brought back memories of quiet evenings spent talking by the fire. He pushed those thoughts away and focused on his guests. "Here," he said, handing Rebecca a steaming cup. "This will help warm you up." Rebecca accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around it. She took a small sip and sighed. "Thank you," she whispered. The baby began to fuss, making small crying sounds. Rebecca adjusted the blanket around the child, murmuring softly. Jacob couldn't help but notice how natural she looked holding the baby, how her voice became gentle and soothing when she spoke to the child. "Is the baby sick?" Jacob asked. "She's very quiet. She's hungry," Rebecca replied. "And cold. I ran out of milk yesterday." Jacob felt a stab of panic. He knew nothing about babies or what they needed. Martha had helped deliver babies in town, but she had never taught him about caring for infants. What was he supposed to do if the baby got sicker? "There's milk from Pete Morrison's cow," Jacob said. "I have some in the cold cellar. Will that work?" Rebecca nodded eagerly. "If we warm it up, yes. Babies can't drink cold milk." As Jacob went to fetch the milk, his mind raced with questions. Why had Rebecca walked so far in a storm? Where was the baby's father? Why had she come to his cabin specifically? He lived so far from any main road that finding his place would be nearly impossible unless someone gave directions. When he returned with the milk, Rebecca was examining the baby more closely. She unwrapped the blanket partially, checking the child's arms and legs. The baby was definitely a girl. Jacob could see now, with tiny perfect fingers and toes. "She's beautiful," Jacob said without thinking. Rebecca looked up at him with surprise. "Yes, she is." Her voice held a note of sadness that Jacob didn't understand. As Jacob warmed the milk over the fire, stirring it carefully to make sure it didn't get too hot, Rebecca began to speak again. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "That is your name, isn't it?" Jacob nodded, wondering how she knew. "I heard about you in town, about your wife passing away, about how you live alone now." Jacob's stirring slowed. He didn't like being talked about, especially his personal business. "What did you hear exactly?" Rebecca hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I heard that you were a good man, that you treated your wife well, and that you wanted children but never had any." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. His private pain discussed by strangers in town. He turned away from Rebecca, focusing on the warming milk. "People talk too much," he said quietly. "I'm sorry," Rebecca said quickly. "I didn't mean to upset you. It's just the reason I came here." She trailed off and Jacob turned back to look at her. The baby had fallen asleep in her arms, tiny chest rising and falling peacefully. Rebecca stared down at the child with an expression Jacob couldn't read. "What reason?" Jacob asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know. Rebecca looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "She isn't yours," she said quietly. "But she needs you." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. Jacob felt his world tilt slightly, as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted. What was Rebecca asking of him? "Her mother is dead." The words fell from Rebecca's lips like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the warm cabin. Jacob nearly dropped the pot of warm milk he was holding. His hands trembled as he set it down carefully on the wooden table. The baby stirred in Rebecca's arms but didn't wake. Her tiny fist curled against her cheek. "Dead," Jacob whispered, afraid to speak too loudly. "How?" Rebecca's shoulders sagged as if carrying an invisible weight. "Childbirth fever took her 3 days ago. Mary was sick for weeks before the baby came, coughing up blood and growing thinner every day. The doctor in Willow Creek said her lungs were bad, probably from the consumption." The firelight flickered across Rebecca's face, showing the exhaustion written in every line. She had walked 30 miles through mountain snow, carrying this orphan child. Why? What drove someone to such desperate measures? "I tried to care for the baby myself," Rebecca continued, her voice growing stronger. "But I don't have enough food, and winter's coming hard this year. The baby needs more than I can give her." Jacob poured the warm milk into a small tin cup, testing the temperature with his finger. Felt just right, warm but not hot enough to burn. He had watched Martha do this for sick neighbors' children, though he never imagined he would need the skill himself. "What's the baby's name?" Jacob asked, offering the cup to Rebecca. "Grace." Rebecca dipped her finger in the milk, then let the baby suck on it. The infant latched on eagerly, her small mouth working hungrily. Mary chose the name before she died. Said every child needs grace to survive in this hard world. Grace. The name seemed to fit the peaceful child. Jacob found himself studying her features. The button nose, the way her dark eyelashes rested against her cheeks, the determined way she sucked the milk from Rebecca's finger. Something stirred in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. But why bring her to me? Jacob asked, settling into the chair across from Rebecca. Surely there are families in Willow Creek who could take her. People with experience raising children. Rebecca's laugh held no humor. You think people are lining up to take in another mouth to feed? Especially when winter's coming and food is already scarce. She shook her head. Most families barely have enough for their own children. And Grace, she's not exactly welcome everywhere. What do you mean? Rebecca hesitated, her fingers gently stroking the baby's hair. Mary wasn't married. The father was a traveling salesman who promised to come back for her. That was 8 months ago. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. In a small town like Willow Creek, that matters to people. They see Grace as tainted somehow. Jacob felt anger rise in his throat. The baby was innocent, regardless of the circumstances of her birth. How could people judge such a small, helpless creature? But he knew Rebecca was right. Frontier communities could be harsh and unforgiving, especially toward women who broke their strict moral codes. So you walked 30 miles in a snowstorm? Jacob said slowly. To bring this baby to a man you've never met, because you heard he was lonely. Not just lonely, Rebecca corrected. Kind. Fair. The kind of man who judges people by their actions, not their circumstances. She looked directly at Jacob, her eyes intense. Mary spoke of you sometimes. She said you treated everyone the same, rich or poor, respectable or not. When you came to town for supplies, you were polite to the women other men whispered about. Jacob didn't remember any specific encounters Rebecca was describing, but he had always tried to treat people with basic respect. Martha had taught him that everyone carried burdens others couldn't see. The baby had finished the milk and was making small, satisfied sounds. Rebecca lifted her to her shoulder, patting her back gently until a tiny burp emerged. The simple domestic scene felt both foreign and familiar in Jacob's cabin. I still don't understand, Jacob said. Even if everything you say is true, what exactly are you asking me to do? Rebecca stood up, walking to the window where snow continued to fall heavily. The storm showed no signs of stopping. By morning, the drifts would be too deep for travel, trapping them all together until the weather cleared. I'm asking you to save her life, Rebecca said quietly. Grace won't survive the winter without proper care. She needs warm shelter, regular food, and someone who can protect her from the cold and hunger. She turned back to face Jacob. I can offer her love, but love doesn't fill empty bellies or keep babies warm when the temperature drops below freezing. Jacob stared at the baby in Rebecca's arms. Grace had fallen asleep again, her breathing steady and peaceful. She looked so small, so fragile. The thought of this innocent child suffering or dying because no one would care for her made Jacob's heart ache. What about you? Jacob asked. Where will you go if I take her? Rebecca's composure cracked slightly. I'll figure something out. Maybe find work in one of the mining camps, or travel further west where nobody knows me. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'm young and strong. I can take care of myself. But Jacob could see the fear behind her brave words. A young woman alone in the territory faced dangers that went far beyond cold and hunger. The mining camps were rough places, full of men who had been away from civilization too long. Towns further west were often lawless, ruled by whoever had the most guns or money. That's not much of a plan, Jacob said gently. It's the only plan I have, Rebecca replied. Unless. She stopped herself, shaking her head. Unless what? Nothing. I shouldn't have even thought it. Rebecca returned to the rocking chair, settling Grace more comfortably in her arms. I just hoped maybe you might need help around here too. Someone to cook and clean, maybe help with your business when travelers come through. But I know that wouldn't be proper, a single woman living with a bachelor. People would talk. Jacob considered her words. The cabin had felt like a tomb for 2 years, silent and empty. His meals consisted mostly of hardtack and whatever game he could shoot. His clothes needed mending, and dust covered every surface Martha used to keep spotless. The business could indeed use someone to help with customers and keep track of orders. People talk anyway, Jacob said finally. Might as well give them something interesting to discuss. Rebecca's eyes widened with hope, but she quickly tempered her expression. You don't have to decide tonight. The storm will keep us here for at least a day or two. You can think about it. See how you feel about having a baby in the house. As if summoned by her words, Grace began to cry. Not the weak whimper she had made earlier, but a strong, healthy wail that filled the cabin. Rebecca stood and began to rock her, making soft shushing sounds, but the baby's distress only increased. She might need her diaper changed, Rebecca said apologetically. I didn't bring many clean cloths. Jacob found himself moving toward them. Martha kept some old sheets in the bedroom chest. We could tear them up, make do until the weather clears. As he rummaged through Martha's belongings, Jacob felt a strange sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in months. He was needed again, not just for his blacksmithing skills, but as a protector and provider. The feeling was both terrifying and exhilarating. When he returned with the clean cloth, Rebecca was standing by the fire, still trying to comfort Grace. The baby's cries had weakened but continued steadily. Rebecca looked exhausted, swaying slightly on her feet. Here, Jacob said, reaching for the baby. Let me try. Rebecca hesitated for a moment, then carefully transferred Grace to Jacob's arms. The baby felt impossibly light and warm against his chest. Her crying stopped almost immediately, replaced by curious hiccups as she stared up at his bearded face. She likes you, Rebecca said softly, and Jacob heard wonder in her voice. As he looked down at Grace's wide, trusting eyes, Jacob felt something break open inside his chest. Not the painful breaking of grief, but the gentler breaking of a heart making room for new love. But was he ready for such a monumental change in his carefully ordered, solitary life? The morning sun painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. Jacob woke to unfamiliar sounds, the soft murmur of a woman's voice and the gentle crying of a baby. For a moment he lay still in his bed, thinking he might be dreaming. Then reality rushed back. Rebecca and Grace were really here, sleeping in his front room. Jacob dressed quickly and stepped into the main cabin. Rebecca was awake, sitting in the rocking chair with Grace in her arms. The baby was fussing, making small hungry sounds that tugged at Jacob's heart. Good morning, Rebecca said quietly. I hope we didn't wake you. She's been restless since dawn. Babies get hungry early, Jacob replied, though he had no real experience with infant schedules. I'll warm some milk. As Jacob prepared Grace's breakfast, he studied Rebecca in the morning light. She looked younger than she had the night before, maybe only 18 or 19. Her dark hair fell in waves around her shoulders, and her brown eyes held a warmth that hadn't been visible in the flickering firelight. The storm stopped, Rebecca observed, nodding toward the window. The snow is deep, but the wind died down. Jacob looked outside. The world had transformed overnight into a winter wonderland. Snow covered everything in soft, rounded shapes, the woodpile, the workshop roof, the fence posts. It was beautiful but treacherous. Traveling would be dangerous for several days until the main paths were cleared. We're snowed in, Jacob said. Could be a week before it's safe to travel. He expected Rebecca to look worried about being trapped, but instead, she seemed relieved. That gives us time to see how things work out, she said. For Grace to get used to you, and for you to decide if this is really what you want. The baby had calmed down, distracted by the dancing shadows the fire cast on the ceiling. Jacob brought the warm milk and watched as Rebecca fed Grace with patient, practiced movements. The scene felt both strange and natural in his usually empty cabin. Tell me about Grace's mother, Jacob said, settling into the chair across from them. You said her name was Mary? Rebecca's face softened. Mary Brennan. She was the kindest person I ever knew, always helping others even when she had little for herself. She worked as a seamstress in Willow Creek, making dresses for the ladies and mending clothes for anyone who needed it. How did you know her? We worked together at Mrs. Patterson's dress shop. Mary taught me to sew, showed me how to make tiny, even stitches that would hold strong. Rebecca smiled at the memory. She had the most beautiful singing voice. She would hum while she worked, little Irish songs her grandmother taught her. Jacob found himself wanting to know more. What happened to her family? Surely she had relatives who could have helped. Rebecca's expression darkened. Her parents died of fever when she was 16. She had a brother, but he went west to California looking for gold and never came back. Mary was all alone when she got sick. Rebecca's voice grew quiet. Just like Grace would be if something happened to me. The weight of responsibility settled on Jacob's shoulders like a heavy coat. This wasn't just about helping one orphaned baby. It was about breaking a cycle of loneliness and abandonment that seemed to follow some families like a curse. Grace finished her milk and dozed peacefully in Rebecca's arms. The cabin felt warm and lived in for the first time in years. Jacob tried to imagine his life with these two people in it permanently. The idea both excited and terrified him. I need to check on my animals, Jacob said, standing up. The chickens will need fresh water, and I should make sure the cow is warm enough. I'll come with you, Rebecca said. Grace should get some fresh air, and I can help with the chores. Jacob started to protest. The snow was deep and the cold was bitter, but something in Rebecca's tone stopped him. She wasn't asking for permission. She was offering to work alongside him. The distinction mattered. They bundled Grace in layers of blankets and stepped outside into the crystalline morning. The snow crunched under their feet, and their breath formed white clouds in the frigid air. Rebecca held Grace close to her chest, shielding the baby from the wind. The small barn behind Jacob's cabin housed 3 chickens, a milk cow, and his horse Thunder. The animals were restless, probably hungry and thirsty after the long night. Jacob began breaking ice from their water containers while Rebecca examined the chickens' nesting boxes. You've got 2 eggs, she called out. Fresh ones, still warm. Jacob felt a ridiculous surge of pride, as if he personally had convinced the chickens to lay eggs for his guests. We can have them for breakfast, with some of that bacon I've been saving. As they worked together in comfortable silence, Jacob found himself stealing glances at Rebecca. She moved with confidence around the animals, clearly comfortable with farm work. Grace seemed content in the cold air, her eyes bright and alert as she looked around at the snowy world. You're good with animals, Jacob observed as Rebecca gently stroked the cow's flank while Jacob milked her. I grew up on a farm outside of Willow Creek, Rebecca replied. My father raised cattle, and my mother kept chickens and a garden. I learned to milk cows before I learned to read properly. What happened to your parents' farm? Rebecca's hands stilled for a moment. They sold it and moved back east after my father hurt his back. Said they were getting too old for the hard life out here. She resumed petting the cow. They wanted me to come with them, but I couldn't leave Mary when she was sick. Someone had to take care of her. Jacob heard the pain in Rebecca's voice and realized she had sacrificed her own security to help a friend. Now she was doing the same thing for Grace, putting the baby's needs ahead of her own uncertain future. That was brave of you, Jacob said quietly. Or foolish, Rebecca replied with a weak smile. I'm not sure there's always a difference. They finished the morning chores and returned to the cabin with fresh milk, eggs, and a sense of accomplishment. As Rebecca prepared breakfast, Jacob watched her move around his kitchen with growing ease. She seemed to instinctively know where things were, as if she belonged there. Grace lay on a blanket near the fire, gurgling happily and waving her tiny fists at nothing in particular. Occasionally she would make a sound that might have been laughter, causing both adults to stop what they were doing and smile at her. She's a happy baby, Jacob commented as he set plates on the table. Mary always said Grace was born with a sunny disposition, Rebecca agreed. Even when she was sick and uncomfortable, she rarely cried for long. It's like she understands that life is hard enough without adding unnecessary tears. As they sat down to eat together, Jacob felt a strange sense of completeness. The cabin buzzed with gentle conversation and the soft sounds of Grace's contentment. For the first time since Martha's death, his home felt truly alive. But questions still nagged at him. Rebecca had walked 30 miles through a dangerous storm to bring Grace to a stranger. That level of desperation suggested there was more to her story than she had revealed. And what would happen when the snow melted and travel became possible again? Would Rebecca really be willing to leave Grace with him and disappear into an uncertain future? "Rebecca," Jacob said carefully, "can I ask you something personal?" She looked up from her eggs, wariness flickering in her eyes. "What do you want to know? Why didn't you try to keep Grace yourself? I understand about not having enough money or food, but you obviously love her. There must have been other options besides giving her away." Rebecca set down her fork and was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I'm not who you think I am, Jacob. And if you knew the truth about me, you might not want either of us in your home." The confession hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. Jacob felt his pulse quicken. What secret was Rebecca hiding? And how would it change everything he thought he understood about her and Grace? The letter arrived like a thunderbolt on the third day after the storm cleared. Jacob heard the sound of hoofbeats crunching through the snow and looked up from his forge to see a man on horseback approaching his cabin. The rider wore the official brown coat of the Territorial Mail Service, which meant he carried important business. Jacob wiped his hands on his apron and stepped outside. The messenger was young, maybe 25, with frost coating his mustache from the cold ride. His horse breathed heavily, white puffs of steam rising from its nostrils in the frigid air. "Jacob Mercer?" the rider asked, pulling an envelope from his saddlebag. "That's me. Got an official letter for you from the Territorial Courthouse in Helena. Judge Caldwell's office." Jacob's blood turned cold as he accepted the envelope. The wax seal bore the official stamp of Montana Territory. He had never received government mail before, and it couldn't be good news. People like him only heard from judges when they were in trouble. "Thank you," Jacob managed, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. The messenger tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Jacob standing in the snow with the letter trembling in his hands. Through the cabin window, he could see Rebecca nursing Grace by the fire. They looked so peaceful, so right together. Whatever this letter contained, it was about to shatter that peace. Jacob broke the seal with numb fingers and unfolded the official document. The formal language was hard to understand, but the meaning became clear as he read. "Mr. Mercer, it has come to our attention that you are harboring a child of unknown parentage without proper legal documentation. Territorial law requires all orphan children to be processed through official channels. A representative will arrive within 2 weeks to assess the situation and determine the child's proper placement." The letter was signed by Judge Harrison Caldwell himself, the man who decided the fate of orphans throughout the territory. Jacob had heard stories about Judge Caldwell, a stern man who believed in following the law exactly, no matter what hardship it might cause. Jacob's hands shook as he read the letter again, hoping he had misunderstood something. But the words remained the same. Someone had reported Grace's presence to the authorities. In 2 weeks, officials would come to take her away to an orphanage in Helena. He stumbled back into the cabin, his mind reeling. Rebecca looked up from where she sat with Grace, immediately sensing something was wrong. "Jacob? What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jacob handed her the letter without speaking. As Rebecca read, her face went pale. Grace continued nursing peacefully, unaware that her world was about to be torn apart again. "They can't," Rebecca whispered. "They can't just take her. You've been caring for her. She's healthy and happy here." "The law doesn't care about that," Jacob said bitterly. "They want her in an orphanage where she'll be one of dozens of forgotten children, where she might get sick or—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Rebecca stood up, clutching Grace protectively. "There has to be something we can do. Some way to fight this." Jacob paced to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape that had felt like home just minutes earlier. Now it felt like a prison. Who could have reported us? "No one comes out here except Pete Morrison, and he wouldn't." Mrs. Henderson, Rebecca said quietly. Jacob turned to face her. What? Mrs. Henderson at the trading post in Willow Creek. I told her I was bringing Grace to you before I left town. She asked a lot of questions about why you would take in a baby, whether it was proper. Rebecca's voice grew smaller. I thought she was just being nosy. I didn't think she would. Tell the authorities, Jacob finished. He felt anger rising in his chest, hot and fierce. Mrs. Henderson was known as the biggest gossip in 3 counties. Of course she would spread the story, and of course it would eventually reach someone who felt duty-bound to report it. Grace had finished nursing and was making small, contented sounds. Rebecca lifted her to her shoulder, patting her back gently. The simple, loving gesture made Jacob's heart ache. How could anyone think this child would be better off in an institution? What do orphanages do with babies so young? Rebecca asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Jacob had visited the territorial orphanage in Helena once, delivering some metalwork they had ordered. The memory still haunted him. Rows of cribs filled with crying infants, older children with hollow eyes and threadbare clothes, overworked caretakers who barely had time to feed everyone, let alone provide individual attention. They try their best, Jacob said carefully, but there are too many children and not enough people to care for them properly. Babies especially. He couldn't bring himself to tell Rebecca about the small cemetery behind the Helena orphanage, where tiny headstones marked the graves of infants who hadn't survived their first winter in institutional care. Rebecca began to pace, still holding Grace. There has to be something, some legal way to keep her. What if you adopted her officially? Would that stop them? Adoption takes months of paperwork and court hearings, Jacob replied, and judges prefer to place children with married couples, not single men. They'd probably use the investigation as an excuse to take her away faster. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and Grace's soft breathing. Outside, snow began falling again, adding to the drifts that already isolated them from the world. But isolation wouldn't protect them from the law. I won't let them take her, Rebecca said suddenly, her voice fierce. I'll run away with her again. We'll go somewhere they can't find us. Where? Jacob asked gently. You barely survived the trip here, and that was only 30 miles. Where could you go with a baby in the middle of winter that would be safe? Rebecca's shoulders sagged as the reality of their situation sank in. There was nowhere to run, no way to hide from the territorial government. Judge Caldwell's reach extended throughout Montana, and winter made travel nearly impossible anyway. Maybe I should tell them the truth, Rebecca said quietly. Jacob looked at her sharply. What truth? Rebecca hesitated, then took a deep breath. About who I really am. About my connection to Grace. She looked down at the baby in her arms. I haven't been completely honest with you, Jacob. There are things about my past, about why I really brought Grace here. Before Rebecca could continue, Grace began to cry. Not her usual gentle fussing, but a sharp, distressed wail that filled the cabin. Rebecca tried to comfort her, but the baby's cries only grew louder. She's burning up, Rebecca said with alarm, pressing her hand to Grace's forehead. She has a fever. Jacob rushed to feel the baby's skin. Rebecca was right. Grace felt much too warm, and her crying had a different quality than before, weak and pitiful. Fear gripped Jacob's heart. Babies could become seriously ill very quickly, especially in winter when doctors were hard to reach. What do we do? Jacob asked, fighting panic. The nearest doctor is in Copper Creek, and that's a full day's ride in good weather. Rebecca was already moving, laying Grace on the blanket by the fire and unwrapping her to check for other symptoms. My mother used to say fevers in babies could be dangerous. We need to cool her down, but carefully. Too much cold could shock her system. As they worked together to care for the sick infant, the letter from Judge Caldwell lay forgotten on the table. The immediate crisis of Grace's health pushed all other concerns aside. But in the back of Jacob's mind, a terrible thought took root. What if Grace became seriously ill just as the authorities were coming to take her away? What if they lost her in the worst possible way? just when they had been forced to realize how much she meant to them. The baby's cries grew weaker, which somehow seemed even more frightening than her earlier distress. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin walls and reminding them how far they were from any help. Time was running out in more ways than one. Grace's fever raged for 3 days, turning the warm cabin into a place of whispered prayers and sleepless vigils. Jacob found himself learning things he never expected to know: how to prepare cool cloths for a baby's forehead, which herbs might help reduce fever, and how to stay awake for hours just watching the rise and fall of tiny breaths. Rebecca barely left Grace's side during those dark days. She dozed fitfully in the rocking chair, the baby against her chest, waking instantly whenever Grace stirred or cried. Jacob brought her food and water, but Rebecca ate little, all her attention focused on the sick child. "Talk to me," Jacob said on the second night, settling into the chair beside Rebecca. "Tell me about this truth you mentioned. It might help distract us both." Rebecca was quiet for so long that Jacob thought she might have fallen asleep. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grace isn't just any orphan baby, Jacob. She's my niece." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. "Your niece? Mary Brennan was my sister. My twin sister." Rebecca's voice cracked slightly. "We looked so much alike that people sometimes couldn't tell us apart, even though Mary was born 20 minutes before me." Jacob stared at Rebecca in the firelight, suddenly seeing resemblances he had missed before. Grace had Rebecca's dark hair, the same shaped eyes, the same delicate features. The family connection was obvious once he knew to look for it. "Why didn't you tell me from the beginning?" Jacob asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. "Because I was afraid you wouldn't take her if you knew I had a blood claim to her," Rebecca admitted. "I thought you might assume I was trying to use you somehow, or that I would try to take her back later." She looked down at Grace's flushed face. "I needed you to want her for herself, not because you felt sorry for me." The revelation changed everything and nothing at the same time. Jacob's feelings for Grace hadn't been based on thinking she was a stranger's child. They had grown from watching her sleep peacefully in his arms, from seeing her eyes light up when he entered the room, from the way his heart lifted whenever she smiled. "It doesn't matter," Jacob said firmly. "Blood relation or not, she belongs with people who love her." "But it matters to the law," Rebecca replied. "If Judge Caldwell knows I'm her aunt, he might place her with me instead of taking her to the orphanage." "Except," she trailed off. "Except what?" Rebecca's laugh held no humor. "Except I'm not exactly the kind of person judges approve of for raising children. I told you there were things about my past you didn't know." Before Jacob could ask what she meant, Grace stirred in Rebecca's arms, making small, weak sounds. Rebecca felt the baby's forehead with the back of her hand and smiled for the first time in days. "Her fever's breaking," Rebecca said with relief. "She feels cooler." Jacob touched Grace's skin and felt the difference immediately. The dangerous heat was fading, replaced by a more normal warmth. The baby's breathing sounded easier too, less labored and more peaceful. "Thank God," Jacob whispered. During the long nights of Grace's illness, he had realized something that scared him. He loved this child as if she were his own daughter. The thought of losing her, whether to sickness or to Judge Caldwell's court order, filled him with a grief he wasn't sure he could survive. Over the next day, Grace continued to improve. Her appetite returned, and she began making her usual happy sounds again. Color came back to her cheeks, and her eyes regained their bright alertness. But even as they celebrated her recovery, the letter from the courthouse remained on Jacob's table like a ticking clock. "We have 4 days left," Jacob said as they sat down to dinner on Grace's first fever-free evening. 4 days before Judge Caldwell's representative arrives. Rebecca had prepared a real meal for the first time since Grace got sick: venison stew with vegetables from Jacob's root cellar, fresh bread, and dried apple pie. The cabin felt warm and homey, filled with the sounds of normal family life. It broke Jacob's heart to think it might all disappear soon. "I've been thinking," Rebecca said as she fed Grace small spoonfuls of warm milk. "Maybe we should tell the judge's man the truth about everything. About who I am, about why I brought Grace here, about how well you've cared for her. And what exactly is the truth about who you are? Jacob asked gently. You keep hinting at some dark secret, but you won't tell me what it is. Rebecca set down Grace's bottle and looked directly at Jacob. I was married before Jacob, for 6 months, to a man named William Shaw in Denver. He was not a good man. Jacob felt his stomach tighten. What happened? He drank too much and had a terrible temper. When he got angry, he would... Rebecca touched her left wrist unconsciously, and Jacob noticed a faint scar there he had never seen before. I left him one night after he nearly broke my arm, took nothing but the clothes on my back and walked out of Denver. That was brave, Jacob said quietly. It was necessary, Rebecca corrected. But it also means I'm still legally married to him, even though I haven't seen him in over a year. A judge looking into my background would discover that. A married woman living with another man, even innocently, would be considered scandalous. It would give them another reason to take Grace away. Jacob felt the walls closing in around them. Every option seemed to lead to the same terrible outcome, Grace being taken away to an uncertain future in the territorial orphanage system. There might be another way, Jacob said slowly, an idea forming in his mind. What if we got married, legally married, before the judge's representative arrives? Rebecca stared at him in shock. Jacob, you can't be serious. We barely know each other. And I'm already married to William, remember? Are you sure about that? Jacob asked. You said you left him over a year ago. If he's never tried to find you or contact you, maybe he considers the marriage over too. And even if not, marriages can be dissolved for abandonment or cruelty. That takes time and legal proceedings we don't have, Rebecca protested. Maybe not, Jacob said, his mind racing. Pete Morrison used to be a territorial judge before he retired. He might know ways to handle this quickly, especially if your husband has been absent for over a year. Grace chose that moment to reach for Jacob with her tiny hands, making soft cooing sounds. He picked her up automatically, and she settled against his chest with complete trust. The simple gesture strengthened his resolve. I'm not asking you to marry me just for Grace's sake, Jacob said, looking into Rebecca's eyes. These past weeks, having you both here, it's made me realize something. I don't want to go back to being alone. I want us to be a real family. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. Jacob, I care for you too. More than I expected to. But marriage is serious and you barely know me. What if you regret it later? What if I regret not trying? Jacob countered. What if we let fear keep us from grabbing the happiness that's right in front of us? Outside, snow began falling again, covering their small world in fresh whiteness. Inside the warm cabin, 3 people who had found each other by chance faced a decision that would determine whether they stayed together or were separated forever. We have 4 days, Jacob said softly. 4 days to figure out if there's a way to make this work. Are you willing to try? Rebecca looked down at Grace, who had fallen asleep peacefully in Jacob's arms. When she looked back up, there was determination in her eyes alongside the tears. Yes, she whispered. I'm willing to try. But even as they made their plans, none of them knew that William Shaw was already on his way to Montana Territory, following rumors of his runaway wife and bringing with him a fury that had been building for over a year. The gunshot shattered the morning silence like glass breaking against stone. Jacob dropped the firewood he was carrying and spun toward the sound, his heart hammering against his ribs. Someone was shooting near his cabin, and in the Montana Territory, unexpected gunfire usually meant trouble. Through the trees, Jacob spotted 3 men on horseback approaching his property. The leader was a tall man with a black beard and an expensive-looking coat, not the rough clothing of most territory travelers. Behind him rode 2 other men who looked like hired muscle, the kind Jacob had seen in mining camps and cattle towns. Rebecca, Jacob called toward the cabin. Take Grace and get to the root cellar. Now. Rebecca appeared in the doorway, Grace in her arms, her face pale with fear. What's happening? I don't know yet, but these men don't look friendly. Go hide until I figure out what they want. The three riders pulled up outside Jacob's workshop, their horses snorting and pawing the snow-packed ground. The leader dismounted with the confidence of a man used to getting his way. His eyes swept over Jacob's property with the calculating look of someone taking inventory. "You Jacob Mercer?" the man asked. His voice carried a slight accent that Jacob couldn't place, maybe from back east somewhere. "I am." "Who's asking?" "Name's William Shaw. I'm looking for my wife." Jacob felt his blood turn to ice water. Rebecca's husband, the man she had fled from over a year ago, had somehow tracked her down to this remote corner of Montana. How was that possible? "I don't know anyone by that name," Jacob said carefully, trying to keep his voice steady. William Shaw smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Rebecca Shaw, about 20 years old, dark hair, brown eyes. Pretty little thing when she's not causing trouble." His hand rested casually on the gun at his hip. "I heard she might be staying with you." "You heard wrong," Jacob replied. "I live alone out here." One of Shaw's companions leaned forward in his saddle. "Boss, there's definitely a woman's been here. Look at the laundry line, got small clothes hanging on it." "And is that a baby's cry I'm hearing?" Jacob's heart sank. Grace had chosen that moment to let out a wail from inside the cabin, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Shaw's eyes sharpened with interest. "A baby?" Shaw said. "That's interesting. Rebecca was always good with children. Maybe she's been playing house with you, Mercer." "The baby belongs to a neighbor woman who's visiting," Jacob said quickly. "She's sick and needed help." Shaw stepped closer to Jacob, and up close, Jacob could see the cruelty in the man's pale blue eyes. This was someone who enjoyed having power over others, who fed on fear and control. "Here's what's going to happen," Shaw said quietly. "You're going to invite me inside for some coffee, and we're going to have a nice, friendly chat about where my wife is. And if I find out you've been lying to me..." He let his coat fall open, revealing not just one gun but two, along with a knife with a bone handle. Jacob had no choice. He couldn't fight three armed men, and he couldn't risk Rebecca and Grace getting hurt. "Coffee's on the stove," he said reluctantly. As they walked toward the cabin, Jacob's mind raced. Rebecca and Grace were hidden in the root cellar behind the kitchen, but the entrance was barely concealed by a loose floorboard. If Shaw searched the cabin thoroughly, he would find them. And then what would happen to Rebecca? To Grace? The cabin felt smaller with 4 grown men inside it. Shaw's companions positioned themselves near the door and window, while Shaw himself settled into Martha's old rocking chair like he owned the place. His eyes moved constantly, taking in every detail of the room. "Nice little setup you got here," Shaw commented. "Cozy. The kind of place a woman would like, I bet." Jacob poured coffee with hands that he hoped weren't shaking too badly. "Like I said, I live alone. Have for 2 years now, since my wife died." "Sorry for your loss," Shaw said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. "Loneliness can make a man do foolish things, like maybe harboring another man's wife." From somewhere beneath the floorboards came a soft sound, just a small thump, but Shaw's head turned toward it like a hunting dog catching a scent. "What was that?" Shaw asked. "Old cabin settles in the cold," Jacob replied. "Wood contracts and shifts." Shaw stood up and began walking around the room, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He paused near the kitchen area, right above where Jacob knew the root cellar entrance was hidden. "You know," Shaw said conversationally, "I've been looking for Rebecca for over a year now. Hired men to track her, followed every lead. Cost me a lot of money." His voice hardened. "She's my wife, legally and properly married. She has no right to run off and embarrass me like she did." "Maybe she had her reasons," Jacob said before he could stop himself. Shaw's eyes snapped to Jacob's face. "What did you say?" "Nothing. Just making conversation." Shaw stepped closer to Jacob, close enough that Jacob could smell the whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. "You seem to know something about my business, Mercer. Makes me think maybe you've talked to Rebecca recently." Another sound came from beneath the floor, this one unmistakably Grace's cry, muffled but audible. Shaw's smile turned predatory. Well, Sounds like that sick neighbor woman is right underneath us. Shaw pulled out his gun and pointed it at Jacob's chest. Why don't you show me where the cellar entrance is? I'd hate for someone to get hurt because you were being stubborn. Jacob had run out of options. He couldn't let Shaw threaten to shoot through the floor toward Rebecca and Grace. Slowly, he walked to the kitchen and pulled up the loose floorboard, revealing the wooden ladder that led down to the root cellar. Rebecca, Shaw called down into the darkness. Come on up here, darling. Your husband's come to take you home. The silence from below stretched for long seconds. Then Jacob heard footsteps on the ladder, and Rebecca emerged from the cellar with Grace in her arms. Her face was pale but determined, and Jacob could see she had been crying. Hello, William, she said quietly. Shaw's expression changed when he saw the baby in Rebecca's arms. What's this? You had a child with this man? His voice turned dangerous. No, Rebecca said quickly. Grace isn't mine. She's an orphan I've been caring for. Liar, Shaw snarled. You run off from your lawful husband and take up with some backwoods blacksmith? And now you're playing at being a mother? Grace began to cry at the harsh sound of Shaw's voice. Rebecca rocked her gently, but her eyes never left her husband's face. Jacob could see the fear there, but also something else, a steel determination that hadn't been there when she first arrived at his cabin. I left you because you were cruel to me, William, Rebecca said. Because you drank too much and used your fists when you got angry. I won't go back to that life. Shaw backhanded her across the face with a sound like a whip crack. Rebecca stumbled but didn't fall, clutching Grace protectively even as blood appeared at the corner of her mouth. You don't get to decide, Shaw roared. You're my wife, my property, and you'll come home with me right now, or I'll make sure this backwoods nobody regrets ever laying eyes on you. Jacob stepped forward, fury overriding his fear. Don't you touch her again. Shaw turned his gun toward Jacob. Or what? You'll stop me? You and what army? But as Shaw spoke, Jacob caught a glimpse of movement outside the window. Someone else was approaching the cabin, someone Shaw hadn't seen yet. Jacob's heart leaped with hope, but he forced himself to keep his expression neutral. You're right, Jacob said, raising his hands. I'm just one man. You've got all the guns. Shaw smirked, thinking he had won. But he didn't notice the shadow that passed by the window, or the soft creak of a boot on the cabin's front porch. The door burst open, and Pete Morrison stepped inside with a shotgun leveled at Shaw's men. Behind him came two other men Jacob recognized, neighbors from the valley who had ridden with Pete. Drop your weapons, Pete commanded in the voice he had used as a territorial judge. Now, the situation had just become much more complicated, and Jacob could only hope that help had arrived in time to save Rebecca and Grace from the nightmare that William Shaw represented. You boys picked the wrong cabin to threaten, Pete Morrison announced, his shotgun trained steadily on Shaw's hired men. The two gunmen looked nervously between Pete and their boss, unsure whether to draw their weapons or surrender. Shaw kept his pistol pointed at Jacob, his face red with anger. This is none of your business, old man. I'm here for my wife, and these local yokels can't stop me from taking what's mine. Actually, they can, Pete replied calmly. See, I used to be a territorial judge, and I know the law pretty well. A man can't just ride onto someone else's property, threaten people with guns, and claim he's within his rights. Jacob felt a surge of relief, but the situation was still dangerous. Shaw looked desperate enough to start shooting, and Grace was crying in Rebecca's arms, adding tension to an already explosive scene. Put the gun down, William, Rebecca said quietly. You're only making this worse for yourself. Shaw's laugh was bitter and harsh. Worse? You humiliated me, Rebecca. You made me look like a fool in front of everyone in Denver. I lost business, lost respect, because people thought I couldn't even control my own wife. Maybe if you had treated me like a wife instead of a possession, I wouldn't have left. Rebecca shot back, her fear giving way to anger. One of Shaw's men shifted nervously in his saddle, glancing between the cabin full of armed men and his increasingly unstable boss. Mr. Shaw, he said carefully, maybe we should just leave. This ain't worth getting shot over. Shut up, Shaw snarled without taking his eyes off Rebecca. I didn't ride all this way and spend all this money to go home empty-handed. Pete took a step closer, his weathered face set in stern lines. Son, you're about to make the biggest mistake of your life. Lower that weapon and ride out of here peaceful-like, and we'll pretend this never happened. Shaw's hand tightened on his gun. I know my rights. She's my legal wife, and I can take her wherever I want. Not by force, you can't, Pete replied. And not when she's expressed a clear desire to stay here. Montana territory has laws about domestic violence, even between married folks. Jacob watched Shaw's face, seeing the calculation behind the madness. The man was weighing his options, trying to decide if he could shoot his way out of this situation. Grace's crying grew louder, adding to the tension that filled the small cabin like smoke. Besides, Pete continued, seems to me there might be some question about whether your marriage is still valid. A woman who's been abandoned by her husband for over a year, with no support or contact, might have grounds for dissolution. I didn't abandon her, Shaw protested. She ran away. After you beat her, Jacob said quietly. I've seen the scars. Shaw's eyes narrowed dangerously. You've seen her scars? Just how well do you know my wife? Blacksmith. The jealousy in Shaw's voice was ugly and threatening. Rebecca stepped slightly behind Jacob, still holding Grace, as if seeking protection. The movement wasn't lost on Shaw, whose face grew even darker. We're going to resolve this the civilized way, Pete announced. William Shaw, you're going to holster that weapon and step outside. Then we're going to have a proper discussion about what happens next. And if I refuse? Pete's smile was grim. Then my friends here will make sure you don't leave this valley alive. Your choice. For a tense moment, Jacob thought Shaw might try to fight his way out. The man's eyes darted between Pete's shotgun, the other armed men, and Rebecca's defiant face. Finally, with visible reluctance, he lowered his pistol. This isn't over, Shaw said to Rebecca. You're still my wife, and I'm not giving up my rights. Your rights ended when you started using your fists, Rebecca replied firmly. Outside, the confrontation continued in the snowy yard. Shaw's hired men had dismounted and handed over their weapons, clearly unwilling to die for their employer's domestic troubles. Pete kept his shotgun ready while the other neighbors watched Shaw carefully. Here's what's going to happen, Pete said in his former judge voice. You're going to get back on your horse and ride out of Montana territory. If we see you around here again, we'll assume you mean harm to Rebecca and the baby, and we'll act accordingly. Shaw's face was purple with rage. You can't banish me. I have legal rights. Your legal rights don't include terrorizing women and threatening peaceful citizens, Pete replied. And if you want to test my authority, remember that I still have friends in the territorial courthouse. Friends who would be very interested to hear about a man from Denver who rides around Montana pointing guns at families. Jacob watched from the cabin doorway as Shaw struggled with his fury and his fear. The man was clearly used to getting his way through intimidation, but he was badly outnumbered here, and his hired help had already given up. Fine, Shaw spat finally. But this isn't finished. I'll be back with proper legal papers. Maybe some federal marshals who understand a man's rights over his wife. You do that, Pete said calmly. And when you do, make sure those marshals know about the witnesses who saw you threaten innocent people with deadly weapons. Make sure they know about the scars on Rebecca's body and the year she spent hiding from your violence. Shaw remounted his horse with jerky, angry movements. His hired men followed suit, both looking relieved to be leaving without bloodshed. As they prepared to ride away, Shaw fixed Rebecca with a stare full of promise and threat. I'll be back for you, Rebecca. Count on it. But as Shaw and his men disappeared into the snowy forest, Jacob felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They had survived the immediate crisis, and Rebecca was safe for now. But Shaw's parting words carried the ring of truth. This wasn't over. Inside the cabin, Rebecca collapsed into the rocking chair, her hands shaking as she tried to comfort Grace. The baby had finally stopped crying, but she remained fussy and unsettled, as if she could sense the danger that had just passed. Thank you, Rebecca said to Pete as he entered the cabin. All of you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come. Pete set his shotgun aside and accepted a cup of coffee from Jacob. Been keeping an eye on this place since I heard about Judge Caldwell's letter. Figured you folks might need some help when that government man shows up tomorrow. Tomorrow? Jacob had been so focused on Shaw's threat that he had forgotten about the impending visit from the courthouse. That's right, Pete confirmed. Judge Caldwell's representative is due here tomorrow morning to assess the situation with little Grace. And after what just happened, I think we need to have a serious talk about your options. Rebecca looked up from the baby with hope in her eyes. Do we have options? Pete's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. Young lady, I've been practicing law in this territory for 30 years. If there's a legal way to keep that child with people who love her, I'll find it. As evening fell over the snowy valley, Jacob felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The warm certainty that he wasn't facing his troubles alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, his small family was safe, surrounded by friends who would fight to protect them. But in the back of his mind, William Shaw's words echoed like a curse. I'll be back for you, Rebecca. Count on it. The question was no longer if Shaw would return, but when and whether they would be ready for him. The knock on the door came at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning. 3 sharp raps that sounded like a judge's gavel. Jacob wiped his sweaty palms on his shirt and opened the door to find a thin man in a black suit standing on his porch, official papers tucked under his arm like weapons. Mr. Mercer? I'm Thomas Whitfield from Judge Caldwell's office. I'm here about the child. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced his voice to stay calm. Come in, Mr. Whitfield. We've been expecting you. The government man stepped inside, his sharp eyes immediately scanning the cabin. He was younger than Jacob had expected, maybe 35, with wire-rimmed glasses and the pale skin of someone who spent his days in courtrooms instead of under the Montana sun. Rebecca sat in the rocking chair with Grace in her arms, both of them dressed in their cleanest clothes. Pete Morrison stood near the fireplace, still wearing his unofficial authority like an old coat that fit perfectly. The baby gurgled happily, unaware that her future was about to be decided by strangers. Quite a welcoming committee, Whitfield observed, setting his leather case on Jacob's table. I wasn't expecting witnesses. Pete Morrison. The older man introduced himself, stepping forward. Former territorial judge, and I'm here to make sure everyone's rights are protected. Whitfield's eyebrows rose slightly. I see. Well, this should be straightforward enough. I'm here to assess the living situation and determine if the child should remain here or be transferred to proper institutional care. Before we start, Pete interrupted, there have been some developments you should know about. Yesterday, this family was threatened by an armed man who claimed legal authority over Mrs. Shaw here. Mrs. Shaw. Whitfield looked confused, glancing between Rebecca and Jacob. I was told the child was being cared for by Mr. Mercer and an unmarried woman. Rebecca took a deep breath. My name is Rebecca Shaw, Mr. Whitfield. Grace is my niece, my twin sister's daughter. Her mother died 3 weeks ago, and I brought Grace here because Mr. Mercer could provide for her better than I could alone. Whitfield pulled out a notebook and began scribbling rapidly. Blood relation changes things significantly. Why wasn't this information included in the original report? Because the person who reported us to your office was more interested in gossip than facts, Jacob said with barely controlled anger. Mrs. Henderson from Willow Creek spread rumors without bothering to learn the truth. The government man continued writing, his pen scratching across the paper like a busy insect. Grace reached toward the sound with curious fingers, making soft cooing noises that filled the tense silence. And this threatening man yesterday? Whitfield asked. What was his connection to the situation? My husband, Rebecca said quietly. My legal husband, who I left over a year ago because he was violent toward me. He tracked me here and tried to force me to return with him. Whitfield's pen stopped moving. He looked up at Rebecca with new interest, studying her face as if trying to read her character from her features. Are you saying you're currently married to another man while living here with Mr. Mercer? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Jacob felt his carefully laid plans crumbling. How could they explain their situation without making everything worse? It's complicated, Pete said smoothly. Rebecca fled an abusive marriage and has been living separately from her husband for over a year. Under territorial law, that constitutes abandonment and grounds for dissolution. Has dissolution been formally requested? Whitfield asked. Not yet, Pete admitted. But given yesterday's threatening behavior, I believe we have strong grounds to pursue it immediately. Whitfield set down his pen and removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly while he thought. Grace chose that moment to let out a happy squeal, reaching toward the dancing dust motes in a shaft of sunlight. The sound was so pure and joyful that even the stern government man couldn't help but smile slightly. The child appears healthy and well cared for, Whitfield observed. But the legal complications surrounding the adults are concerning. Judge Caldwell prefers clear, uncomplicated placements. What if those complications were resolved? Jacob asked suddenly. What if Rebecca was free to marry legally, and Grace had two parents instead of one? Rebecca stared at Jacob in surprise. They had discussed this possibility, but hearing him propose it in front of the government official made it feel suddenly real and terrifying. Whitfield put his glasses back on. Marriage would certainly improve the situation from the court's perspective. Married couples are preferred for child placement. But the current legal entanglement with the abusive husband presents problems. Problems that can be solved, Pete said firmly. I've been researching territorial statutes, and there are provisions for emergency dissolution in cases involving domestic violence and abandonment. With proper documentation of yesterday's threats and Rebecca's injuries, we could have papers filed within days. The government man reopened his notebook and began writing again. I would need to see evidence of the abuse, testimony from witnesses to yesterday's confrontation, and formal petitions for dissolution and adoption. Jacob felt a spark of hope. How long would that process take? Emergency dissolution could be granted within a week if the evidence is compelling, Whitfield replied. Marriage could follow immediately after, and adoption proceedings could begin simultaneously. Grace had grown tired during the adult conversation and was beginning to fuss softly. Rebecca stood and began walking with her, the gentle motion calming the baby immediately. Watching them together, Jacob was struck again by how natural and right they looked as mother and child. There's something else you should consider, Pete said to Whitfield. This isn't just about one orphan baby. Rebecca herself is young and alone, with limited prospects for survival in this territory. Separating her from her niece and forcing her back into an abusive marriage would be condemning two people instead of saving one. Whitfield nodded slowly. I understand the human element, Mr. Morrison, but I have to follow the law and Judge Caldwell's guidelines. Emotion alone isn't sufficient basis for legal decisions. Then let's talk about practical matters, Jacob said, finding his voice. I own productive land, a successful blacksmith business, and this cabin. I can provide food, shelter, clothing, and education for Grace. I can give her opportunities she would never have in an orphanage. And I can provide the maternal care she needs, Rebecca added. I know her family history, her mother's songs, the stories she should hear about where she came from. In an institution, she would lose all connection to her heritage. Whitfield stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the snowy landscape while he considered their arguments. The silence stretched until Grace's soft breathing was the loudest sound in the room. I'm going to make a recommendation to Judge Caldwell, Whitfield said finally, turning back to face them. But it's conditional on several requirements being met. Jacob held his breath. First, formal dissolution proceedings must be filed against William Shaw within 3 days. Second, Mr. Mercer and Mrs. Shaw must be legally married within 2 weeks. Third, official adoption papers for Grace must be completed within 30 days. Rebecca's knees went weak with relief, and she sank back into the rocking chair. You mean Grace can stay? If you meet those conditions, yes. Judge Caldwell believes children belong with families when possible, not in institutions. But if any of those requirements aren't met, Grace will be removed to the territorial orphanage immediately. The weight of the ultimatum settled over them like a blanket. They had won a reprieve, but now they faced a race against time and law to make their temporary family permanent. "There's one more thing," Whitfield said, putting his papers back in his case. "If William Shaw returns and causes more trouble, or if he contests the dissolution, this entire arrangement could be threatened. Judge Caldwell won't tolerate ongoing domestic disputes involving children in state custody." As the government man prepared to leave, Jacob realized their real battle was just beginning. They had to navigate complex legal proceedings while protecting themselves from William Shaw's promised return. Grace's future and their own happiness depended on winning both fights simultaneously. But looking at Rebecca's determined face and Grace's trusting eyes, Jacob felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Some things were worth fighting for, no matter how difficult the battle might be. The wedding dress hung from Martha's old sewing hook like a ghost made of ivory silk. Rebecca had worked on it every evening for the past week, her needle flying through the delicate fabric as she transformed one of Martha's stored gowns into something that fit her smaller frame. "It's beautiful," Jacob said softly, standing in the doorway of what would soon be their shared bedroom. Martha would have loved seeing it worn again. Rebecca looked up from where she knelt, pinning the hem. Dark circles shadowed her eyes from nights spent sewing by lamplight, but her expression held a quiet happiness that made Jacob's heart skip. "I hope I'm not dishonoring her memory by altering it." "You're honoring it," Jacob replied firmly. She always said her best dress should be worn for joyful occasions, not left to gather dust in a trunk. Tomorrow was their wedding day. Pete Morrison would perform the ceremony in his capacity as a retired judge, and several neighbors had promised to attend as witnesses. The dissolution papers for Rebecca's marriage to William Shaw had been filed and approved with surprising speed, helped by Pete's connections and the documented evidence of Shaw's violent threats. Grace lay sleeping in her makeshift crib, a wooden box lined with soft blankets that Jacob had crafted in his workshop. At 3 months old, she was growing stronger every day, her dark eyes following movement around the room and her tiny hands grasping at anything within reach. She had become the center of both their worlds without either of them quite realizing when it happened. "Are you nervous?" Rebecca asked, setting aside her sewing. Jacob considered the question honestly. "About marrying you? No. About whether we can make this work as a real family." "Sometimes." Rebecca stood and walked to the window, where snow continued to fall in the gathering dusk. "We barely know each other, Jacob. People usually court for months or years before making such commitments. People usually don't fall in love while caring for a sick baby together either," Jacob replied, "or face down armed men in their living room. I'd say we've learned more about each other in 3 weeks than most couples discover in 3 years. He moved to stand beside her at the window, their shoulders almost touching. Outside, his small world looked peaceful and secure, but Jacob knew that appearance was deceiving. William Shaw's threat still hung over them like a sword, and the legal requirements from Judge Caldwell's office created their own pressures. "What if Shaw comes back after we're married?" Rebecca asked quietly. "What if he brings federal marshals or finds some legal way to cause trouble?" "Then we'll face it together," Jacob said simply. "As husband and wife, as Grace's parents. United." Rebecca turned to look at him, studying his face in the fading light. "You really mean that, don't you? You're not just saying what you think I want to hear. I mean every word." Jacob reached for her hand, finding it warm despite the cold evening. "Rebecca, I need you to understand something. I'm not marrying you just to keep Grace, though I love her like my own daughter already. I'm marrying you because these past weeks have shown me what my life could be with the right person in it." Tears gathered in Rebecca's eyes. "I feel the same way. When I first brought Grace here, I thought I was just finding her a safe place. I never expected to find my own safe place too." Grace stirred in her sleep, making small sounds that drew both adults to her side. She was growing so quickly that Jacob sometimes worried he would miss important moments while working in his shop. Her first smile, her first laugh, the day she would sit up on her own, he wanted to be there for all of it. "She's going to ask questions someday," Rebecca said softly. "About her real parents, about why she lives with us instead of them. And we'll tell her the truth, Jacob replied, that her mother loved her enough to bring her into the world, and that we loved her enough to make her our own. Some children are born to their families, and others are chosen. Grace was chosen. A knock at the door interrupted their quiet moment. Jacob opened it to find Pete Morrison stamping snow from his boots, his weathered face serious despite the approaching celebration. "Evening, folks. Mind if I come in? Got some news from town that you need to hear." Jacob's stomach clenched with familiar worry. "What kind of news?" Pete settled into the chair by the fire, accepting a cup of coffee from Rebecca. "Had a visitor at my place today. Federal marshal named Coleman, asking questions about recent disturbances in the valley." "Shaw," Rebecca breathed. "That's right. Seems your former husband made good on his threat to involve federal authorities. Marshal Coleman is investigating claims that you were kidnapped and are being held against your will." Jacob felt anger rise in his throat. "That's ridiculous. Rebecca came here voluntarily, and she's free to leave any time she chooses." "I know that, and you know that," Pete said. But Shaw painted a different picture. "Claims you're holding his wife hostage and trying to steal his legal property through fraudulent marriage." Rebecca sank into the rocking chair, her face pale. "What did you tell the marshal?" "The truth. That I witnessed Shaw threaten you with weapons, that I saw evidence of abuse, and that the dissolution was granted legally and properly." Pete sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Marshal Coleman seems like a fair man, but he has to investigate the claims. He'll be here tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Jacob's heart sank. "The day of our wedding?" "Afraid so, but that might work in our favor. If the marshal sees you getting married of your own free will, with witnesses and proper ceremony, it'll be hard for Shaw to claim you're being held against your will." Grace woke up and began crying, as if sensing the tension in the room. Rebecca picked her up automatically, rocking her gently while her mind raced with new worries. "What if the marshal decides Shaw's claims have merit?" she asked. "What if he stops the wedding or takes Grace away?" Pete leaned forward in his chair. "That's why timing is crucial. We need to have the ceremony first thing in the morning, before the marshal arrives. Once you're legally married to Jacob, Shaw's claims become much weaker." "How early?" Jacob asked. "Dawn. I can perform the ceremony at sunrise, with the neighbors as witnesses. By the time Marshal Coleman gets here, you'll be husband and wife, and Grace will have 2 legal parents instead of 1. The plan was risky but necessary. Jacob looked at Rebecca, seeing his own determination reflected in her eyes. They had come too far to let William Shaw's vindictiveness destroy their chance at happiness. "Then that's what we'll do," Jacob said firmly. "We'll be married at dawn, and when the federal marshal arrives, he'll find a legal family that no one can separate." But as Pete prepared to leave and spread word about the early ceremony, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that Shaw had one more surprise waiting for them. Men like that didn't give up easily, and they rarely fought fair when their pride was wounded. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering their tracks and muffling sound. It was the kind of weather that could hide approaching riders until they were almost at the door. Jacob bolted the cabin securely and checked his rifle, hoping he wouldn't need it, but knowing that hope wasn't always enough. Tomorrow would bring either the beginning of their new life together, or the end of everything they had built. There was no middle ground left, no room for compromise or retreat. They would stand together as a family, or fall separately as strangers. Grace fell asleep in Rebecca's arms, trusting and peaceful, unaware that her entire future hung in the balance of the next few hours.